He bought her at auction for just $3, not to own her, but to free her. What she did next turned a forgotten ranch into a sanctuary of hope. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that one act of kindness can change a life forever, subscribe now for more powerful, soul-stirring stories that prove humanity still exists. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty frontier town of Larkspur Junction, the wind dragging dry dirt in lazy spirals through the main street. It was a day like any other, yet a small crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's barn, where a makeshift auction block had been set up under a sagging canvas. It wasn't cattle they had come to see, nor wagons or tools. Today, it was pipeline indentured. Workers, mostly immigrants, whose debts had turned into invisible chains. Some had been here for years, surviving by the grace of strangers. Others were newly arrived and already discarded. Whispers floated through the crowd like ash from a fire, some curious, others disgusted, a few amused. Enslaved stood a slight, narrow-shouldered girl, with hair as black as the river's deep bend and eyes dark as polished coal. Her name was May, though no one here knew that, and few cared. She looked no older than 17, her wrists bound loosely with hemp rope, her chin held high despite the bruises barely fading from her cheek. Her faded tunic hung like paper over her frame, but she stood with a kind of stubborn dignity that made people uneasy. When the auctioneer gestured toward her and began the bidding, silence fell. $1, he barked. Nothing. Fit for sewing or small chores. Light eater, $2. He tried again. The onlookers averted their eyes. Some shook their heads. One man chuckled and muttered she wouldn't last a week out here. The auctioneer, irritated, waved a fly off his brow and snapped, "Come on now, folks. $3? That's nothing. You'd pay that for a sack of flour." Still, nothing, until a slow, steady voice came from the back. $3. Heads turned. A tall man in a weather-beaten coat and wide-brimmed hat stepped forward, his silver beard catching the sun. John Carter, long-widowed, quiet and plain-spoken, wasn't known for foolish decisions, nor for charity. The auctioneer blinked, then smiled awkwardly. $3 it is? Sold. A few snorted in disbelief. "What's he going to do with her?" someone whispered. "Teach her to talk to cows?" Someone else laughed. John ignored them. He walked forward, handed over 3 worn silver dollars without flinching, and stepped to the girl. She looked up at him warily. She didn't flinch, didn't bow. Her eyes, unreadable and fierce, searched his face for clues. She had been passed from hand to hand, kitchen to laundry, shed to cellar since she was small enough to carry in a rice sack. She had learned long ago not to ask questions. This man. He hadn't looked at her like a problem to be solved. He looked at her like someone who mattered. "You speak English?" he asked gently. May gave the slightest nod. "A little." John reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small knife. May stiffened, instinct braced, but he didn't touch her. He simply held the blade up to the rope and sliced it clean. The frayed strands fell to the ground. Her hands dropped to her sides. "You're free," he said. She blinked. The words didn't make sense. No one bought you and then gave you freedom. She stared at him, lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. He turned, then paused and looked back. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then nodded once. "Come on then," he said. "Let's get you out of this dust." The crowd watched as she followed him, walking a few steps behind her arms, folded protectively. The town would talk, of course. They always did. But John Carter didn't bring her home to make a point. He brought her home because he remembered what it was like to have no one. He had once come back from the war with broken ribs and no letters, to an empty farmhouse and a grave that still bore his wife's name. He had buried a child too small to hold on to, and a part of himself with her. The world could be cruel, and sometimes the only answer was a quiet act of defiance against that cruelty. As they rode in his wagon down the dirt road away from the town, May said nothing. She watched the endless fields of tall grass and the far-off shapes of cattle moving slowly against the horizon. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was cautious, honest. When they arrived at Carter Ridge, His ranch nestled between wide plains and a grove of whispering cottonwoods. He handed her a glass of water and showed her the barn. "You can rest there tonight, or in the house. If you'd rather, I'll be out in the field till dusk." She stood in the doorway, clutching the cup, unsure what to do with this odd mixture of freedom and hospitality. She had been bought, but not claimed. Given water, not orders. Given space, not suspicion. That night, she lay on a pile of hay in the loft and stared up at the wooden beams. Through the cracks in the boards, she saw a sliver of sky, a deep, vast blue she had never had time to notice before. She whispered something in Cantonese under her breath. A prayer, or maybe just a name. She didn't know what the next day would bring. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel like something disposable. The ranch was quiet, and the air smelled of earth and horses and hope. And somewhere in that quiet, in the sound of grass shifting in the wind, a seed of something real was planted. Something more valuable than $3 silver could ever measure May awoke with the sunrise. Unsure if she had truly slept or merely hovered between memories and fears all night, the loft was still, save for the soft snorts of horses below and the whisper of the wind weaving through the slats. She sat up slowly, blinking at the warm golden light pouring through the gaps in the wood. Her muscles ached, her stomach growled, but she wasn't afraid. That was new. She crept down the ladder, bare feet padding across the barn floor, half expecting someone to shout at her, to demand work, to punish her for resting. But no voice came. Outside, the ranch stretched like an open hand, vast and quiet. She found a bucket of water on the porch, fresh and cool, and a folded towel beside it. A simple gesture, but it made her throat tighten. On the kitchen table, inside the house, sat a plate of eggs, bread, and an apple. A note lay next to it in rough handwriting. Gone to fence line. Eat, if you want to help. Follow the creek east. She ate slowly, almost suspiciously, savoring each bite like it might be taken back. Then she stood, wiped her hands, and stepped into the morning air. The creek wasn't hard to find, its lazy curve sparkling in the sunlight. She followed its path through tall grass and scattered willows until she spotted him, John Nelling. Beside a broken post, hammer in hand, a coil of wire looped at his feet. He looked up and tipped his hat. "Morning." May nodded in return. She didn't know how to say what she felt. Gratitude, confusion, a hint of guarded reliefs. So she did what she knew. She knelt beside him and picked up a hammer. He didn't ask why she was there. He simply handed her a nail. They worked in rhythm, the silence between them filled with the thump of wood and the whine of metal tightening. Sweat beaded on her brow, dust clung to her sleeves, and still she worked. At noon, he passed her a tin cup of water. She drank and stared out across the field. "Big," she said softly. "Too big for one man," he replied. She looked at him, then at the worn lines on his face, and nodded. After that, the days took on a shape. He rose early, fed the hens, hauled water, swept the porch. John showed her how to saddle a horse, how to tell a healthy calf from a sick one, how to listen for changes in the wind. He didn't hover. He didn't scold. When she made mistakes, he corrected her patiently. When she succeeded, he said simply, "Good." And that was enough. She didn't talk much. Her English was improving, but it still twisted in her mouth. Like an unfamiliar song, yet words weren't needed for everything. Some things were learned by watching, by doing, by sitting in shared silence as the sun dipped behind the hills. At night, she sometimes read the old books he left out for her, weathered volumes about soil, seasons, horses, and the land. He must have known she was reading them because one morning he left a Chinese-English dictionary on the table with a note, "Might help." She traced the faded cover with her fingers, tears welling up uninvited. No one had ever tried to help her speak before. Weeks passed, then months. The townsfolk began to notice. At first there were whispers. Was he keeping her as a servant? Was she working off a debt? Was it improper? But when folks visited Carter Ridge, they didn't see a prisoner or a servant. They saw a young woman who worked as hard as any ranch. Hand who spoke with growing confidence, who met their eyes, and offered water and hospitality. May never tried to charm anyone. She had learned long ago that survival did not depend on being liked, it depended on being useful, on earning her space. But her quiet presence challenged their assumptions, and slowly their mutterings faded into nods of respect. One day, the sheriff rode up, his horse kicking up dust as he dismounted. He eyed May warily and asked John if he was aware there were laws about taking in people like that. John set down his tools and looked the sheriff square in the eye. "She's not livestock," he said. "She's not property. She works the land, same as me. That's all you need to know." The sheriff shifted, coughed, and muttered something about watching out for trouble, then rode off. May had watched the exchange from a distance. That night, she left a note on John's workbench, scrawled in careful English, "I stay. I work. I learn. You gave me name back." John never said anything about the note. But the next morning, he handed her a small brass key and said, "This one opens the front door. Use it whenever you like." Shh. She took it with trembling fingers and held it like something sacred. Years of being locked in, watched, ordered gone, replaced with a single act of trust. That evening, she stood on the porch with him, watching the sky turn lavender. "You lonely?" she asked quietly. He glanced at her, surprised by the question. Then he nodded. Sometimes she looked out across the fields. "Me too," she whispered. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't need to. There were two people, shaped by loss, bound not by blood or expectation, but by shared silence and the labor of building something out of broken pieces. And though neither said it aloud, they both knew this was no longer a favor or charity. This was home. Not because it had been given, but because it had been earned through sweat, through soil, through the quiet, sacred decision to see another as a human being. And that made all the difference. The years passed quietly, like wind moving through. Tall grass barely noticed, but never still. Seasons turned over the land like pages in a book, and with each one, May grew into herself. The girl who once stood silent and bound beneath a sun-bleached auction sign was gone, replaced by a woman with sun-toughened hands, a proud gait, and eyes that spoke without needing translation. Carter Ridge no longer felt like someone else's land. It breathed with her footsteps now, with her laughter rare, but re-land with the soft hum of her voice as she sang old songs while tending the fields. John watched her from a distance most days, knowing his time was winding down like a stubborn old clock. His body ached more. His steps slowed, but there was peace in his heart, knowing that something of worth would remain when he was gone. Not just a ranch, but a life he helped set free. He never treated May like a daughter, nor tried to mold her into anything she wasn't. He had simply given her space to choose, and she had grown into more than he'd ever expected. She oversaw cattle trades now, met with ranch hands, rode into town alone, and returned with supplies and stories. Some folks called her Miss Carter, others just May. It didn't matter to her. What mattered was that no one looked through her anymore. One late spring afternoon, as the cottonwoods bloomed and the creek sang louder than usual, John called her out to the old tree on the ridge. The one where he had once carved his son's name, the one where he always seemed to rest when the world felt too heavy. She brought him tea, noticing the shake in his hands and the new thinness in his frame. He smiled, tired but sincere. "You remember the first day you got here?" Looking out at the horizon. She nodded. "I thought you were crazy." He chuckled, a gravelly sound. "Maybe I was. But it was the right kind of crazy." Then he pulled a folded envelope from his jacket and handed it to her. It was thick, official-looking. Her brow furrowed as she opened it. Inside was the full deed to Carter Ridge signed, notarized, her name neatly printed at the top. "I don't understand," she whispered. "It's yours now," he said. "I've no kin left. No one else I trust to care for this land." Her hands trembled. "You don't owe me this." John looked at her, eyes soft and resolute. "This was never about owing. I didn't rescue you, I just opened a door. You walked through it, built everything after that with your own hands. You earned this, May. More than anyone I've ever known." She felt tears gathering, but she blinked them back. He hated fuss. She knew that. Instead, she sat beside him, holding the deed in one hand and his weathered hand in the other. They watched the sun slip lower, gold light dancing on the hills, shadows lengthening like memories across the land. He died quietly a few weeks later. In the same bed his wife had passed in, the house silent except for the wind and the slow ticking of the old mantel clock. May dressed him in his best shirt, combed his hair, and buried him beneath the cottonwood tree he loved. She carved his name herself into the headstone with careful hands. John Carter, a man who chose kindness. The funeral was simple. Few neighbors, ranch hands, even the sheriff came. No one questioned her place. No one doubted that Carter Ridge was hers now. But May didn't sit idle in her inheritance. She could have sold it all, left the dust behind, returned to the cities. But she didn't. Instead, she walked the land. Every morning, touching fence posts, checking the soil, whispering to the horses. She spoke to John sometimes, softly, as if he were still sitting on that porch with his coffee and his silence. And slowly, an idea grew in her heart. A purpose. Carter Ridge had once saved her life. Not just her body, but her name, her identity, her sense of worth. What if it could do the same for others? She started small. A boy from the railroad camps, coughing blood and too thin to work. A runaway girl from back east, bruised and afraid. May gave them shelter, food, safety. Taught them how to ride, how to mend fences, how to believe in the land the way she had learned to. Word spread. More came. Orphans, widows, broken souls from places too cruel to speak of. Carter Ridge became more than a ranch. It became a refuge. A place where the past wasn't erased, but rewritten. Where pain was met with purpose. The townsfolk were skeptical at first, but even they couldn't deny the change. The land thrived. Crops yielded more. Horses grew strong. And the people May's people stood tall. They weren't charity cases. They worked, laughed, healed. And every one of them knew the story of how the woman who ran the ranch had once been bought for $3, only to become its owner. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned to fire, May stood on the porch with a cup of tea. A child laughed in the yard. Chickens clucked softly nearby. Inside, a meal simmered, and voices chatted around the table. She closed her eyes and breathed it in this place, this life. She didn't need a monument, didn't want her story turned into legend. What mattered was that it was real, that someone once looked at her and didn't see a price tag, but a person, that she had taken that single act of grace and built something no one could take away. She looked out over Carter Ridge and whispered into the dusk, "You gave me my name back. I gave it a home, beneath the great cottonwood tree, where the wind always sang. It felt like he heard her.